the star in Legend of Boggy Creek. And there wasn't one.
Charles Peters, isn't he in it?
He was in Boggy Creek too in the 80s, yes. So the thing is, if you think about before the 70s, right? And we think about all these great actors that we love, like in the Hammer films, we're talking about Peter Cushing, we're talking about Christopher Lee, we're also talking about Vincent Price. These horror icons who became synonymous with horror, and we love those eras too. But then you think about the 70s, and you think about somebody like Tobe Hooper, or William Girdler, or Chuck Pierce, right, who don't have access to that kind of talent. Yes?
How about Hal Adamson?
Yeah, okay, absolutely.
I like a lot of his movies.
Right.
They were trash.
It's just a little more on the expectations.
Frankenstein.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, even the late Wes Craven, you know, he was working in the New York sort of film circle there. I mean, so that's regional too, although when we consider New York, it's sort of easier to go. It's easier to go from New York to Hollywood than it is to go from, I think, Kentucky. We would all agree, right?
Yeah.
Right, okay, like, but Girdler still did it. I mean, in Girdler, I don't know if you know this, but The Manitou was his last film. He died in a helicopter accident scouting locations for his next film. I mean, we don't know what he would have done. We don't know what he would have done in the 80s if he would have risen to be somebody like a Wes Craven or John Carpenter, right? So I always think that it's tragic that we didn't get to find out. But the 70s, to have all that different energy from different parts of the country. We're not yet talking about things like franchises, right? The 80s, when we think of franchises, we think Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Hellraiser towards the end of the 80s, right? We think of all the franchises, how horror became franchised. And I'm not saying that's bad, but that's a whole different vibe than the 70s, which is somebody out there on their ingenuity, intestinal fortitude, whatever. They get a bunch of talented people, and they go out and they make this thing. They make Free on New York. They make Talent Dread Sundown. Or even John Carpenter. He did go to film school. They make a Halloween. Of course, he had access to people like Jamie Lee Curtis, Donald Pleasance. But they go out and they make these films, and these films take off, right? To me, that is what is so glorious about the horror films of the 1970s. This capacity for filmmakers to come out of nowhere, make a really great film, and we all know that. I mean, you think about Wes Craven in the 70s. Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes. Okay, those films are still in the cultural conversation today, right? Think about Girdler. I don't know if those are still in the conversation. Think about Tobe Hooper. Sadly passed away, but Texas Chainsaw Massacre is still a part of the conversation. There's still Texas Chainsaw Massacre films being made almost 50 years later, right? And, of course, in the Hollywood system, we got a film 50 years ago that changed horror movies forever. Well, what am I talking about? 50 years? The Exorcist. How many people saw The Exorcist in the theater? Okay. Scared the bejeebies out of you? I always say that's one of the few films I will not watch alone in my house even to this day. After all the times I just won't. I won't. Remember the scene with Ellen Burstyn in the attic? People always remember the head spinning.
Like,
yeah, that's right, yeah. She goes up into the attic and and the candle, right? That's terrifying stuff in that film, right?
that was a jump scare.
But it was. But think about this. Horror movies did change how we see and understand movies, because 2 years after The Exorcist, what came? The summer of 1975.
The Rocky Horror Picture.
Not what I was thinking, but yes, right? So there was another film, Jaws, right? And Jaws is considered
The first one.
the first blockbuster. But I say, go back 2 years. You go back to watch archival footage from '73 of The Exorcist, and you see lines around the block for The Exorcist, just like we did with Jaws.
Yeah, December. It was like December 26th.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, people were calling.
At Christmas time, people were going to see this. And to be clear, it was as controversial a horror film to ever succeed, because we had people like the Reverend Billy Graham saying, this is an evil movie. No, I mean, Exorcist.
Oh, yeah.
Exorcist, yeah. So we've always had people tell us, don't enjoy this, don't look into this. But to me, what I found such joy in my career and writing these books, and I assume you have since you're all here, it is looking into the dark of these movies. I don't think they're evil movies, but I think they're movies that show us aspects of humanity, of our lives, of the human condition. Now again, some people say, John, you're not talking about like the gutter horror movies. I'm like, no, there are some, of course, that are like just pure exploitation. I'd be a fool to say that. But like, that's true of every genre. Every genre has bad examples, right? But the horror movie always gets kind of attacked because people are afraid to look in that mirror, right? And, well, I guess I should ask y'all, are there any 70s horror movies y'all want to talk about? I'm just giving you sort of my background about what I look for and enjoy in horror movies, and why I like the 70s so much. And obviously I was there in the 70s, there's nostalgia. Is it nostalgia for you all, or is it the excitement of what was happening in the 70s, the unpredictability? You did not know what you were going to see. I mean, going into a theater in 1974, well, I mean, the title might give it away, but the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, to be in for that. So I show that film to my students sometimes, and the first thing I say is, it's okay to laugh. Because aren't there some funny things in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre too? Think about the cook, he broke my screen door to Leatherface and he's hitting him with a broom. And even in something as bizarre as that, there's something we recognize as human, whether it's family or what have you, that we connect to. Right? So what is it, you're all here at this panel, what is it that brings you, what is it that interests you about horror films in the 70s? Why do you like that era? That sad cinema era? Yes.
Escapism.
So you like the escapism angle? Okay.
It's like going on a roller coaster without really going on it.
Yeah.
And the jump scares is the things that affect me now. Like, I can't watch a horror movie and get scared anymore, but the jump scares, I'm sitting in a darkened theater, and the last one was that last Exorcist, the new one. They had a lot of jump scares in there.
Yeah, okay.
The Believer, I was like, every time something happened, I jumped.
It's so funny you say that, because my wife Catherine's here, and as I said, she watches these with me. But I call her my barometer, because I have watched so many horror movies for these books. It's hard for them to work on me, so I do the first thing I want to say is is it scary? Because that's the most important thing about a horror movie. Is it scary? Is it going to frighten us? And then I layer on all these things. Does it have meaning? Is it relevant? Is it related to our culture? But so I love to watch them with her because they work on her so well. Yes, yeah. The movie where she was out was actually an '80s movie, and it was a fairly tame one. I don't know why this was her out, but except that she was expecting our son. She was pregnant, and I was watching April Fool's Day from the '80s. I don't know if anybody's seen that one.
Yes, it's a
But
good movie.
but there is a moment here. There's a moment in the film where somebody jumps into the water and there's a pier and like a ferry crushes his head between the pier and the ferry, and she just got up. She said, "That's it. I am done. I am done until I have this baby." Right? I am done. But the 70s. Let's say so. Back to the 70s. So I agree. Like, we have to have that. Like, it has to be scary, right? Do you all agree? Like, if a horror movie isn't scary, that's the first thing. That's always my first. People say, I'm described as a film critic, but I prefer to say I'm a film appreciator because I always want to like a film. I don't get any pleasure, I think maybe some critics do, in tearing a film down. I take pleasure in finding a great one, right? Like, oh my gosh, can you believe this, right? When you run across one of the, don't you all feel the same way when you run across one, especially if you weren't expecting it to be good? So, I never look to put down a film. I look to be immersed in the film. And the first thing for me for horror is it has to be scary. Is that the first thing for everybody here? Or what?
I don't think so. I think it's more an adrenaline
rush or an excitement, because Dawn of the Dead isn't necessarily scary. It's, you're on your seat the entire time.
Yeah.
You're wondering what's gonna happen.
Right.
They're in a position, are they gonna get out or not?
And I don't think George Romero gets enough credit for the fact that he is able to craft scenes of great suspense. The scene where they're jockeying the trucks up and down to block the doors for the shopping mall, and the one SWAT guy, can't remember his name, but the young blonde guy, he's getting all cocky and too big for his britches, right? And he's playing around, and you know, he's going from cab to cab of the truck, and his leg is hanging out, and you see the zombie going between the narrow passage between the two trucks, going for his leg. That scene is incredibly suspenseful, so the adrenaline there from the suspense, for sure.
See, I'm very much like him, it's the anticipation and waiting for something to happen. Like I just recently watched The Exorcist, and I forgot that the whole first part of that movie, nothing happens really. And it's just the build-up of when is something going to happen, when is something to the bed bounce up and down, right? God, it's just the slow build of all the things. Same thing with Carrie. Here was the same. We watch Carrie and nothing really happens until the end. Yeah. So for me, it's the anticipation, the build-up of the closer and closer to the thing. What's going to happen?
You know, it's so interesting because The Exorcist, one of the things that I think makes that final act so powerful is that we have that first act in Iraq. It's almost like you go to archaeologically, right? And you're just following Father Mary, right? And it's not trying to scare you, but there's this kitchen sink kind of reality to it. You know, and then we go back to Georgetown, there's something wrong with Regan, the little girl. But then think about it, it's almost like a documentary of like what is wrong with her. She's going to go get this medical test, and she's going to go get this medical test, and it's painful, and we're watching her go through all these things in the hospital. So it's like before we're even reckoning with the pea soup and the spinning head, where again, it's like, what is it really telling us about? It's telling us about modern medicine, about medicine and our culture, about things like how do we relate to hospitals, to doctors, how do they relate to us when we're sick? So there are all of these other things in the film that are unsettling, and it's sort of chipping away at us a little bit at a time. So by the time we get to those fireworks in the last act, the movie has us because it has felt so real and so immediate leading up to that. And so it's not a conventional build of suspense, but it's like a building up of atmosphere or reality, so that by the time all the demonic stuff happens, we're invested and we believe everything that's happened so far. Because you could look at the special effects now and say, oh, they've aged a little bit. But it almost doesn't matter because we've been so well prepared through those first two acts with that sort of cinema verite. You are there, you are immersed in these experiences, either in Iraq or in the hospital. Yeah, I agree. Slow build is great. But let me ask you this. Do you all have a film that you found from the 1970s that you just champion and love that like other people don't love? So I'm not talking about the Halloweens or the Texas Chainsaw Massacres or The Exorcist.
I'm going to probably get some laughs for this, but Dracula versus Frankenstein.
Okay, all right.
Because, you know, they have, it's Lon Chaney's last movie. J. Carol Nash's last movie.
Okay.
But the way Al Adamson did this, it started as a biker movie, and they said, and then somebody said, well, let's make it into a monster movie, because that's why they had Russ Tamblyn in the movie, because it was originally going to be a biker movie. That's what I learned about it, and I mean, it's so cheesy, but the way the guy that plays Dracula, the way his voice is in the movie, it's like amplified or something, and you know, Dracula with an afro actually.
Okay.
And of course he had those plastic fangs that you can buy at the 5 and 10. Well, they were, and it's so bad it's good.
Absolutely. And does anybody else feel like they enjoy the films that are just kind of cheesy and campy? The thing that I always remember is does anybody remember from the 70s, very early 70s, the Count Yorga vampire film? And in the second one, I don't remember, Return of Count Yorga, at some point Yorga is not on screen and the hero is, but you just hear Count Yorga's voice, like it's over a loudspeaker, so he says, "Hello, I'm coming to kill you." I mean, it's just the strangest thing. It's something like that. And it's just so utterly bizarre. And in the 70s, I really love that new freedom that I think the filmmakers had to try things and go for things. Like, that was so weird. Like, how was his voice being amplified? Like, vampires can just, they're ventriloquists too, I guess, right? They can just throw their voice, right? But I know one of the films that I go back to, and I'd love to know if any of you have seen this and what you think about it, but the first film I reviewed for Horror Films of the 2000s, I think it's the first book in the movie, I mean, it's not Horror Films of the 2000s, Horror Films of the 1970s, excuse me, was And Soon the Darkness. Has anybody seen And Soon the Darkness?
Robert West.
Yes. Okay, so it's a film, so this was before, we can all discuss like when we think the slasher movement arose. Was it Black Christmas, or was it Halloween later in the 70s? But I say, go back to the year 1970, this British film, And Soon the Darkness. It is one of the most suspenseful and terrifying films of that era. Pamela Franklin is the star. You might remember her from Legend of Hell House, right? And she and Michelle Dottris is the other young woman in the film. They are two British nurses on a bike trip through rural France. And it all takes place in one afternoon. There's also a killer on that road. They can't speak French, so there's a language barrier. And it's getting dark. And they don't know who they can trust. The gendarme is strange and they can't communicate with them. They see somebody following them with sunglasses, and they go back and forth across this stretch of rural road as the sun goes down. It's really great. So if you have not seen that, that is, like, for me, like, that's the reason to write these books, because I obviously haven't seen every horror film, but I'll say, okay, so what are the 300 or 400 films I'm going to cover in this book? And so, okay, so I'm putting on And Soon the Darkness, I've never seen it. Here I am writing it in the year 1999-2000, so this film is 30 years old. And I love being able to excavate these movies and find these things like And Soon the Darkness. There's a terrible remake in 2010, don't watch that one. Amber Heard was in the Pamela Franklin role, so don't watch the remake. But watch the 1970 one if you get the chance, if you're looking for one. You won't be disappointed. You can see so many of the signs of the slasher film and what was to come, including the idea of the final girl, including the red herring, all the elements we come to associate with slashers later on in the late 70s and early 80s are in this 1970 British film. So I recommend that. But does anybody have anything, like the secret gem from the 70s that people don't talk to you enough, don't talk enough about? Anybody know any? Yes.
See Andy Warhol.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
You
You
watch
watch
so
those?
bad they're good.
Catherine, my wife, loves those. She'll watch those anytime. Right. Yeah. So those are very interesting films, right?
Yeah.
Graphic, on the cutting edge of sort of sexual norms for the time as well, right?
That was another question I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Was, with the 70s and independent producers, was it basically the independents and then just saying, we're not going to follow the Hays Code anymore? Because none of those movies followed. There was no, you can't have this, the evil person always has to pay. They just threw it out the window.
Absolutely. And that's what makes those films so interesting, I think, is so I always say horror should transgress, or it's not horror. Because we have what I call movie decorum in other movies, that we expect a certain set of things to happen. We don't really get scared in a movie because we know the movie has to follow that decorum, right? Mm-hmm. So the good horror movies are the ones that go outside the decorum and transgress. And then, as soon as that happens, we start to feel unsafe in the theater. We're watching a movie, and we make this contract, sort of, with the movies. We sit down and we're going to have this. We're going to have our lead, we're going to have our villain, we're going to have the scales of cosmic justice righted. If somebody does something bad, it will be punished, right? Now, the beginning of the change of that was not in the 70s. It was, of course, what Hitchcock did in Psycho. When Psycho, when he killed Janet Leigh, right? It's like, oh, what are we going to do now? I have no point of identification. Wait a minute, you just killed the biggest star in the movie. Okay, if you didn't see Psycho in the theater, and I didn't, so I've always kind of been sad that it didn't quite work on me. I always knew what the trick was going to be, so it didn't quite work on me. But what I did do is I showed it in my class to an audience of Generation Z students who don't know Psycho from Adam. So they don't know what it's about, they know nothing about it. It works, right? It works on them, and I'm so happy. They're shocked and stunned by the ending of Psycho because they don't know what's coming. It's like, oh my gosh, it's so perfect, it's come around again, right? But what he did there was he took away the point of identification. So when you kill Janet Leigh, who do we turn to and identify with? We have two people there. We've got her sister, Lila Loomis, but we also have Norman, right? So that, of course, again, transgresses because Norman, as we find out, is the killer. Everything we thought to expect about, he's this nice guy having his little sunflower seeds, right? 12 cabinets, 12 vacancies. He's told us his story about his sick mother and how he wants to get away, and we become invested in him, and it's a nasty trick, isn't it? Right? In the 70s, they went further, and this is why I love Tobe Hooper and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because my wife says this is how I live my life, but Tobe Hooper adopted the idea in horror and brought to horror the idea of no learning. If you watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, there is no learning. There's no traditional plot. So somebody walks into that cannibal house and they get killed. Another one of the kids walks into that cannibal house and they get killed. Somebody else. So in other words, there's nobody to carry the plot and the knowledge on forward of what's there to defeat them. So that whole movie is like a journey into entropy, where nobody ever learns from any of the experiences the characters go through. That is transgression. That undercutting the 3-act structure, the contract we have with filmmakers that as we go through, we're going to learn about what happened so that we can then at the end defeat the bad guy and right the scales of cosmic justice. If you take learning out of that equation, which I think is what's so brilliant about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you've subverted the very structure of film. And notice there is no correction at the end. Now, Hitchcock had to correct at the end of Psycho, didn't he? Norman got put away, and then we had the psychiatrist come and explain to us and the other characters exactly what had happened, what Norman's psychosis was, right? Because the scales of cosmic justice had to be righted. Studios said you can't have them leaving the theater feeling unnerved and uneasy. You can't do that with audiences. Well, just a decade later, that's exactly what Tobe Hooper did. Think about the ending of Chainsaw. Right? Does anyone remember the end of Chainsaw? The sun is going down and Leatherface is whirling around doing a crazy dance with the chainsaw, and then it just cuts to black. And she's, Sally Hardesty is on the truck bed listen, there are going to be no scales of justice right for her, obviously, right? So the 70s was all about this kind of transgression and the idea that you could see something in a theater that would truly upset you. So let's talk about another film that did that. I don't know how you all feel about it because it's a controversial film, but Last House on the Left. Yeah? Okay.
What was up with in the Last House on the Left? What was up with those weird like comedy bits with those goofy cops. It seemed like it was a different movie.
No, you're absolutely right. Martin Cove was one of the cops, I think, and they have to like get on a chicken truck at one point. Okay, so Last House on the Left is about these terrible criminals who abduct these two young women, take them out into the woods, and I mean it's terrible. It's sadism, it's violence, it's rape. But the cops find out about it not more than halfway through the movie, but can't do anything to get there, right? They're like comedians, they're like Keystone Cops or something, right?
Yeah.
So, what was Wes Craven doing there? It's very simple. Think about what was happening in 1972 when that film came out. So, it was a very different time. You know, I don't want to get political, but politics is part of a cultural discussion. We were starting, okay, there had been many riots in the country. People also began to view police officers differently than they had in the past. Think about the Democratic National Convention in '68 and the violence people saw. Okay, I'm not placing a negative judgment on police officers or a positive judgment, I'm just saying it was an issue in the country, right? And one of Wes Craven's big ideas, you see this in his Nightmare on Elm Street films as well, and in The Hills Have Eyes, is the concept of the illusion of authority and the illusion of law. So, you have these criminals, the police know about them, they spend all movie, never get to them. And it's infuriating. He plays it as a joke, so you're watching these things, I hate these people, I hate these police officers, they're so incompetent, and it's a statement on authority in the United States at that time. Because what does have to happen, I mean, let's talk about what happens in that film. The twist, of course, is that the killers, after they murder these two young women, they end up at the parents' house of one of the girls, Mary. And the parents realize, with these criminals standing in their house, they say, I forget what it says, they say the car broke down or something like that, so they're staying at the house till they can get their car fixed. They realize that these terrible men, and one woman, have killed their daughter. Do they wait for the law? Do they wait for the law to show up?
Nope.
No. So again, we're getting back to the concept of law, authority in the United States, and they take the law into their own hands, don't they? With a chainsaw and a scene I probably shouldn't discuss in public, but in a spinning block. Okay. But there was a song in the film. Do you remember the song that was played many times in Last House on the Left? The lyrics are, the road leads to nowhere, and the castle stays the same. And the mother said to the father, wait for the rain. Wait for the rain. So that song played so many times in the movie, and then Eli Roth put it in Cabin Fever in 2003. But anyway, okay. So what's it telling us? That it's talking about authority, the castle staying the same, is us, is the United States, is our families, whatever, right? It's telling us the road leads to nowhere, that even though the parents have killed these criminals, the last shot of the film is a freeze frame of the mom and dad soaked in blood. Has anything gotten better? Has anything changed? No, the castle stays the same even though they've taken the law into their own hands. So again, really transgressive messages, in these early Craven films, like we're seeing Hitchcock subverting structure, like we see Toby Hooper, subverting structure in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So to me, those films are very powerful and worthwhile because of the way, not only what they're about, but the way they play with form and the way they tell us about ourselves and who we are in the culture and the things our culture is grappling with. So anyway, I love that stuff. I can talk about that all night. But does anybody else have any sort of 70s films that they love?
I think it was 1978, the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. I saw that in the theater when I was 9, and I so wish I hadn't because I was afraid to go to sleep for weeks.
Yeah.
I was telling them because the transformation from person to pod person occurs while you sleep. And I love the 50s original.
Oh, me too.
It's great.
I
but
had not seen that one
Yeah.
before I saw the 78.
me either, because I saw
And the
it.
ending was just so bleak. you
Yes.
know, And it was just, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love the 70s invasion of the Body Snatchers. I think one of the most clever things it did was to cast Leonard Nimoy
Yes.
as an emotionless pod person. Right? Because it's like, no, they won't do that. You know, we all know he's Spock. He's not going to be one. Well, no, he is, right? But that film is transgressive in its own way, too. Because if you look at the 50s film, and people interpret that one in two ways. Either it's like anti-communist, they either see it as very right-wing and anti-communist, or they see it very left-wing and anti-McCarthyist. I'd love to put two fans of that movie together who are on the opposite side and do a cage match, so we can see which one to win. But you could interpret that 50s film either one of those ways. There are signals and symbols where you could do that. The 70s film, which I think it felt more relevant to me, still does, because I'm a product of late 60s, 70s, 80s. It was all about this idea of personal alienation. And so what was happening in the late 70s when that film came out? The divorce rate in the United States was skyrocketing. We were getting all of these self-help books, and that's even a factor in there. And I'm trying to think what some of the titles were, like I'm Okay, You're Okay, things like that. But and I'm not putting down self-help books. I believe everybody should find help wherever they need it. But there's also an egotism to this. It's like, yes, thank you, yes. There's an egotism to this, which is that I can't be in a relationship and be married if I'm not like 100% satisfied every minute, right? There's also that, and then if you're in that, that's wrong. Not to say there aren't legitimate reasons to leave a marriage as well. Again, I don't want to get into it bad. But so the film played in that territory, didn't it? And this idea that you marry somebody, you're with them a couple years, and then you say, "You've changed. You're not the person I married." All the things about you, like, I know it looks like the person I married, but they're not the person I married. The person I married wouldn't do this, right? So it was like brushing up against the ideal of marriage in our country, and this idea that we would be alienated from our spouses, literally, that they're aliens. But I think what was so clever about the 70s one, I don't know if you feel this way, but then we saw the whole process of it more. And it was also, of course, playing on Watergate. Do you remember late in the film, Donald Sutherland's character is trying to reach Washington, D.C. from San Francisco, and he's calling. His name is Dr. Bennell, and this is where we saw the operators on the, he says, "Operator, connect me to Washington, D.C." Whatever. And before he has said anything or identified himself, she says, "Yes, Dr. Bennell, I'll connect you," right? So we're talking about like conspiracy, cover-up, Watergate, government watching you, all of this kind of stuff in that film too, right?
Wasn't there something like that in the 56 version too?
I'm trying to
He
remember.
was calling somewhere.
The operator had been turned.
Okay.
And he couldn't get
I'm sorry, all the lines are busy,
Yeah,
we can't put you through to
yeah.
the state police.
And there we actually saw her at that one of those old switchboards, right? Yeah. So, and to go back to my film class, I teach Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, The Wolfman, Invasion, 56 Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So I'm so glad you mentioned that as well as the 78.
I like it even better than
Yeah.
the 78, but I
Yeah.
said 78 first.
I think the 78 one is the best, but I also understand that's a product of like my age. But like I like those. Hey, there's my son, Rachel. Those are the film techniques that I find the most appealing and interesting. But also that bleak ending. We didn't get a Hollywood ending.
Yeah.
Right? Does everybody know? I hope I wouldn't be spoiled, but do you all know the end of Invasion of the Body Snatchers?
It's supposed to be bleak, that the first one.
What's that?
The first one.
Yes.
They ended it bleakly, and then they made it go back and shoot another scene.
Right. So again, if you look at how Hollywood treats horror movies, they always want to pull back so that you don't leave the theater feeling upset and mad at them. Right? If you left the 56 Invasion of Body Snatchers, and it was bleak. Our audience is going to be angry with us, right? But in the 70s, like, oh, hell with that, right? We're going to go into bleak. So let's talk a little bit about that. Why that bleakness is such a part of the 70s. So let's talk about some of the things that were happening in the 70s. So I mentioned Watergate, right?
Gas prices.
Gas prices, oil embargoes, OPEC. Everyone remember OPEC and the gas lines? Yep, in 73, in 77, 79. We had 3 different ones, right? Vietnam, right? 3 Mile Island, 78, right? 3 Mile Island, right? The Watergate crisis. I mean, we were having. What's that?
The Olympics.
Yes, Munich, right? Oh my gosh. So, all the things that were happening, this is sort of the introduction for my book. Like, all of the pillars that had held up America previous to the 70s. So we're talking about patriotism. Okay, well, we just lost a war in a really bad way. All right, so we got Vietnam. So knock down the pillar of patriotism holding us up, right? Well, what about religion? How about that as a pillar? Well, does anyone remember the Time magazine cover that was in Rosemary's Baby from the late 60s? What was on the cover?
Yeah.
Is God dead, right? Okay? So people leaving organized religion en masse, right? Okay, so bing, knock down that pillar holding up America, right? So what about government? What about government? Well, shall we tick off what was happening there? That's right. Yes. Jonestown, absolutely. So we had the Watergate crisis. Right? What's that? The Pentagon Papers. Thank you. Yes. The Iran hostage. Yes. Oh my gosh.
Cocaine.
Cocaine. That's how we got through all this. So then, okay, so let's say, what else then? What about the economy? Was the economy a pillar? Maybe we had 4 pillars. No, the economy was not good in the sense we had stagflation, right? Okay.
With inflation.
With inflation now buttons, yes, right.
Well, even when you were saying like down the debt, that's the time that the steel mills were leaving Pittsburgh. So not only had you lost your job, your chances of getting a job and living in the area. My wife is from there.
All right. So think about this. Think about all of these movies in previous generations where like there wasn't this conflux of all this, like those pillars, maybe they weren't all standing, but at least 2 were standing or 1 was still standing. Now you get to the 70s and all of those pillars holding us up, cracked, falling down. And then you have these horror movies that come and take advantage of that. And so again, I talk about this idea of uncertainty, that the horror movie has to transgress, right? Because what really makes it scary to us is when we don't know, we actually feel like there's a danger in the theater world. When you watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I mean, the first time you watched it, this movie is crazy, anything could happen, oh my God, what am I gonna see? But now imagine you have that experience, but the experience is also you're going to a theater during a time when you feel like you can't trust the president anymore. We've just lost a war. The economy is in danger. So imagine all the uncertainty you feel then added to all that stuff in the horror movie, right? And then that's why I think these movies are so classic. They're so amazing because it's not just the transgression. It was like what's in the water of the 70s. Like imagine making movies in that era. Yeah.
My colleague over here brings up a very valid point, which couldn't have hit at a more interesting time cinematically. Legalization of hardcore pornography.
Right.
We've talked a lot about the increasing gore standards of the 70s.
Right.
The sexual standards were expanding as well.
Absolutely, and there was a brief time in American culture, and it's hard for us to believe now, where it's like suburban couples living in New Jersey would go to take the train to New Jersey and they go watch I'm Curious Yellow or Deep Throat or Behind the Door, right? And that was like completely acceptable, right? And so that was a change too, a huge change, huge sea change in the culture. And think about how many horror films of the 1970s involve in some way reproduction. Okay, I know this is going to sound odd, but let's talk about Alien. Right? Alien, before we get into the franchise and everything else, so let's just talk about Alien as alone, the only one in the 70s. It is all about reproduction, is it not? Think about all the characters in the film and how they sort of represent different aspects of sexuality and reproduction. Think about how they die, things like yes.
Consider that O'Bannon's original idea was, how can a man get raped by a vagina?
Right. So
That was the
again,
stated intent of the horror.
yeah. So I mean, you look at Alien. Okay. How graphic should I be? Okay. So, but there's one point in the movie. Can I use your schedule? There's one point in the movie where Ash has gone crazy, the synthetic person, the android, and he's got Sigourney Weaver down. And he gets a magazine and he's trying to jam the magazine.
It's a porno magazine.
The porno magazine down her throat. Sorry, you're filming this. I don't want that to be that. That's okay. But right there, we're seeing some aspect of that. And then what does he do when he can't do it? Think about all that white milk flying everywhere, right? I mean, this is absolutely about sex. It is absolutely about sex. You can't deny it. Another film from the time period, does anybody think any of those have to do with sex? Or reproduction, if we check?
The Brood.
The Brood! Yes. Oh my gosh, David
That was
Cronenberg.
more about divorce.
He did an earlier one, and was it called Shivers?
Shivers.
Where there was this, the parasite,
Came from Levine.
right, and it also involved sex.
Rabbit.
Rabbit, right? Think about all these, in terms of reproduction, think about, and this is like about reproduction and having children, think about It's Alive, right? The fears, again, this is so 70s, because we were afraid of everything in the 70s. We were afraid of pollution, we were afraid of microwave ovens, we were, every single thing. If you watch that movie, it's like just a collection of different fears being thrown at you, like what made this baby a monster? Did the mom stand too close to the microwave? Was it that she was exposed to chemicals in the rain? Was it that, right? It's all these different things, and it's never settled, right?
Another one that's pollution was almost a great movie, Prophecy.
Prophecy, oh my gosh, yes, 1979, yeah. Talking about environmental horrors, pollution, right? We had a lot of these eco-horrors in the 70s as well. We were afraid of so many different things. I mentioned Day of the Animals, that's another eco-horror. Hole in the ozone layer. I mean, we could choose any way, like 100 ways to die in the 70s. Something terrible was going to get us.
How about frogs? And they have nothing to do with, they're not even frogs, they're toads. But it's all the animals.
Today the pond, tomorrow the world.
Yeah,
Yes.
they have that poster with the hand coming out of his mouth.
Right.
And what I learned about this movie was that they had to import all these animals, because they're not found in Florida, by the way. And when the lady goes out for the butterflies, none of the butterflies are flying. And the bird scene, they had to use like stock footage from something else.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's funny you bring that up because for me, as a film appreciator, you watch a bunch of things, you learn the tricks that the filmmakers use, and I love that. Never in that film is Ray Milland in the same shot with a frog. He's never in the same frame with a frog. He had a good agent. They said, yeah, I'll do frogs, but I'm not going to be near any frogs, right? Okay. But another eco horror like that. Does everybody know Kingdom of the Spiders?
Yeah.
Okay. So again, yes, William Shatner. And what was the cause of the spider attack on Mesa? Yes. Pesticides, right? Again, something else that we use every day is going to kill us in the 70s. Another, you remember?
Food of the Gods.
Food of the Gods, and what was its sister movie?
Empire.
Empire of the Ants, right? Toxic chemicals make ants grow to giant size.
And that was actually kind of two movies in one, because the second half is like a paranoid mind control.
Right. So that's probably back to conspiracies and cover-ups or something like that. But the 70s is so fascinating for the sheer number of things that are frightening us. So again, I've written 4 of these books. So like 2000 to 2009, it's pretty clear. 9/11 was in 2001, and the rest of the decade we were dominated by, xenophobia, fear of terrorism, fear of the other, the outsider. Okay, the 90s, okay, was pretty easy too. That was when we had the Human Genome Project, so people were becoming afraid of genetics. We had movies like Jurassic Park, plus all the serial killer movies where you use DNA to hunt the serial killers. Okay, again, pretty clear. 80s even is pretty clear. The kind of stuff we had, like in the latter half, we had fears about AIDS, things like that. In the earlier part, we had this very, and I'll talk about this more tomorrow, but this conservative morality embodied in things like the Friday the 13th films, like vice precedes slice and dice. If you have sex out of marriage, Jason's going to kill you. If you smoke weed, Jason's going to kill you. So it was very clear. But the 70s, it's like everything. So it was hard to chart. Like when I wrote that book, it was the first one of these I wrote. So I hope I got better. But it was hard to chart like all the things we were so terrified of that were going to kill us. We're terrified of how we mistreated the environment. We're terrified of pollution. We're terrified of war. We're terrified of nuclear power, things like that. So, just the amount of quote-unquote boogeymen in the 70s is staggering compared to other decades. And maybe that's one reason I like it too, because I never get bored of this. Like, what am I afraid of today? Let's see. Let's turn this on. Let's turn on this movie and say, oh yeah, let me re-experience this. There are a lot of movies in the 70s where children are the monsters.
Who can kill a child?
Who can kill a child? Right? The Omen.
Children of the Corn.
That was the 80s, but yes, we still, right? Okay. So, I'm sure Carrie was a young person, right? Okay. I think Carrie was actually about our fear of women. Culture, not ours, not maybe, but the cultural fear of women to some extent.
Because I had a friend try to convince me that it was about men's fear of menstruation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, valid. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, I always say in a horror movie, if you're, and again, it's alive, a baby that's going around killing people. In a horror movie, if the child is the monster, what does that tell you? There's no tomorrow. There's no hope for the future. If our children, who are literally our future, are the things killing us, we're in trouble, right? And again, you have so many movies like that in the 70s where the children are actually the monsters. They're the ones who are destroying us, which, again, I think is so fascinating. And I read a book some years back. It's called How We Got Here. I think it was David Frum who wrote it. And he pulled up some statistics that showed like that, the birth rates were going down too, that people didn't want to have the nuclear family. Marriages were failing, we talked about in light of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but also like the nuclear family was coming apart and people were having fewer children or deciding not to have children. And again, I'm not judging anybody's choice, I'm just saying that was a trend in the 70s, right? So again, you see why these movies start coming up at that time. Right? There was actually like a fear of children. See, that sounds crazy, but remember, I actually had a quote on that from David Frum's book. It's like, oh, that's perfect. It's like when you find a quote that says something you want to say, that's so great. Right? In the book, it's like, yeah, we got that there. So that was a huge aspect of 70s horror films as well. We saw many, well, let me ask you all about gore. Where does gore sit for y'all? Important, not important in a horror film? Less important than other things?
Well, I've been thinking about a British movie, Living Dead of the Manchester Ward, because it has fear of technology and the authorities in general, because both the scientific authorities and the police are worse than useless throughout that. And the attacks in that always to me seem almost like a sexual attack.
Right.
And the gore, I don't know if I'd call it gratuitous. It's more like there's just this atmosphere of not just that nobody's safe, but that something could happen at any moment that's completely brutal.
Right. Well, does anybody remember Zombie from 1979?
All right.
Someone gets their eye through like a chip in a broken door, right? It's like, oh wow, how much gorier can we get?
Fulci had a thing about eyes.
Yeah, it does.
Fulci had a thing about eyes. That's the best I can describe.
It wasn't a cat on the brain, it was an eye on the brain.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the zombie eating a shark.
Right.
Well, one zombie that was in the water, and I heard that it was a shark that was like half dead or something.
Right.
But the zombie was like biting the shark.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that reminds me, like, when you watch all these movies in a short amount of time, you start to see these crazy connections. So we had Jaws, right? And everyone wanted to beat Jaws. And Dino De Laurentiis made a movie called Orca, in which a killer whale beat a shark, right? And then in Jaws 2, at the beginning of Jaws 2, there's a dead killer whale on the beach at the beginning of Jaws 2. And then we have Fulci come along and say, forget a killer whale or a shark, zombies can kill Jaws, right? And there's like this little competition among filmmakers to have the most terrifying beast or animal.
Had the same thing with Sam Raimi and Wes Craven. They kept putting each other's posters in like the Hills Have Eyes poster in the basement.
Right, and if you watch Nightmare on Elm Street, Nancy's watching Evil Dead. Yeah. So I love that stuff. But remember the gore. Okay, so how many people were around to see Alien in the theater? Okay. So right. Do you remember? I mean, I remember seeing. I don't know if they do this anymore, but back in the day when films like Star Wars or Star Trek, the motion picture, Alien came out, they get people coming out of the theater saying, "What did you think of it?" and stuff like that. Well, do you remember out of that? Like, people were throwing up in the theater from Alien. They're like, people were running out of the theater vomiting. And that's a big Hollywood film. So they're like, you can't be unhappy. You have to have a happy ending, but it's okay if you vomit during the movie. That's all right.
Okay, we are up against it.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay,
So
so
do you have any final thoughts?
well, I love sharing this time with you. Right? Yes.
I just wanted to say, I think that the 70s was interesting too, because it was like one of the first times that anti-heroes were kind of a thing.
Right.
Where like there was an unreliable narrator and anybody could be a lead. It wasn't always just a goody-goody two-shoes. So that's like an interesting facet.
I think Assault on Precinct 13, right? That's a great example of that. Yeah.
Taxi driver.
Was that Taxi Driver? Oh my gosh! Right. Yeah. So I hope you'll come to the 1980s one tomorrow. We can talk about slashers. I don't know what time that is, but 2:30, maybe 2 o'clock, something like that. But come find me at my table. I'm selling some of my books.
2:30.
I'd love to talk horror films with you all. Thank you for being so awesome.
Thank you, guys.